Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Orleans. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1845, when the Mississippi River carried more secrets than fish, the disappearance of Henry Duval went largely unnoticed by most residents of New Orleans. The 53-year-old bookkeeper had worked for the Maro shipping company for 22 years, maintaining meticulous ledgers that few ever bothered to examine closely. On September 23rd, Henry failed to report to work at the Maro offices on Chartres Street. His absence was noted only because the recently widowed Celeste Maro, aged 47, had specifically requested his presence for a review of the company's quarterly accounts. Mr. Duval did not strike anyone as the sort who would simply vanish, stated a report filed with the city constable 3 days after his disappearance. He was known for his punctuality and dedication to Mrs. Maro's business affairs. The constable made the customary inquiries at the man's modest residence on Dauphine Street, finding nothing amiss except for a half-finished cup of coffee and an open ledger on his writing desk. No signs of struggle, no evidence of robbery, no farewell note. The investigation might have ended there, filed away as another unexplained disappearance in a bustling port city where men frequently abandoned their lives for new beginnings elsewhere. But two things prevented Henry Duval's case from being forgotten. First, the strange testimony of Amelia Trudeau, age 39, who lived in the apartment across from Duval's. And second, the discovery made 6 weeks later in the basement of the Maro family's Garden District mansion. Amelia Trudeau's account was recorded by Constable William Forrest on September 26th. I heard Mr. Duval leave his apartment at approximately 15 minutes past 11 on Monday evening. This struck me as unusual, as he rarely ventured out after dark. Through my window, I observed him walking briskly toward Canal Street. He carried what appeared to be a leather satchel. What disturbed me was not his departure, but the fact that he paused at the corner and appeared to be speaking with someone who remained in the shadows. I could not see this person, but Mr. Duval's demeanor suggested he was not entirely at ease. The constable noted that Miss Trudeau seemed genuinely concerned, though he privately dismissed her observations as the imaginings of a spinster with too little occupation. In 1845, a man leaving his home at night was hardly cause for alarm. Nevertheless, the report was filed and would later be exhumed when circumstances warranted a more thorough investigation. Celeste Maro's connection to Henry Duval was, on the surface, strictly professional. After the death of her husband, Jacques Maro, in January of that same year, she had assumed control of the family's shipping business. According to all accounts, she was a formidable woman of considerable intelligence and determination, qualities that had earned her both respect and resentment in New Orleans' male-dominated commercial sphere. The Maro family had arrived in Louisiana in the 1790s, establishing themselves through strategic marriages and shrewd business dealings during the transition from French to American rule. The Maro Shipping Company operated primarily between New Orleans and ports in France, Cuba, and Brazil. What made their enterprise particularly profitable was their willingness to transport whatever cargo yielded the highest return, with few questions asked about provenance or legality. This flexibility had positioned them well during the tumultuous economic periods that followed the Panic of 1837. By 1845, their fleet consisted of 6 vessels, and their warehouses along the Mississippi held goods from 3 continents. According to company records later reviewed by investigators, Henry Duval had begun his employment with the Maros in 1823, hired by Jacques Maro's father. His background before joining the company remained somewhat obscure, though it was established that he had received some education in Philadelphia and had briefly worked for a banking house in Charleston. What made him valuable to the Maros was his exceptional facility with numbers and his apparent lack of moral qualms regarding certain business practices. In the weeks following Henry Duval's disappearance, Celeste Maro displayed what witnesses described as appropriate concern. She cooperated with the constable's inquiries, offered a modest reward for information, and arranged for Duval's duties to be assumed by a junior clerk. But those who knew her well noted a certain tension in her manner, a guardedness that seemed excessive even for a woman of her naturally reserved disposition. Mrs. Moreau was not herself in the weeks after Mr. Duval vanished, recalled Marie Lafitte, aged 54, who had served as the Moreau family's housekeeper for 17 years. She would start at small noises, and twice I found her in the library after midnight, burning papers in the fireplace. When I inquired if she required assistance, she dismissed me sharply, which was unlike her. She had always treated the household staff with courtesy, if not warmth. What Marie Lafitte observed but did not report until much later was that Celeste Moreau had ordered the basement of the family mansion sealed off approximately 1 week after Henry Duval's disappearance. The basement had previously been used for storage and wine cellaring, but servants were now strictly prohibited from entering it under any circumstances. When questioned about this decision, Mrs. Moreau cited concerns about structural integrity following heavy rains that September. On November 7, 1845, Dr. Thomas Blackwood, aged 61, was summoned to the Moreau residence by an agitated Marie Lafitte. According to his medical journal, which was submitted as evidence during subsequent inquiries, he found Celeste Moreau in a state of extreme agitation, pacing the drawing room and muttering incoherently. When he attempted to examine her, she reportedly seized his arm with surprising strength and said, "It was necessary. You must understand that it was necessary." Dr. Blackwood administered a sedative and remained at the mansion until Mrs. Moreau fell asleep. In his journal, he noted his concern about her mental state and his intention to return the following day. However, events would overtake this plan. Shortly after the doctor's departure, at approximately 11:30 that night, neighbors reported hearing a woman scream from the direction of the Moreau mansion. Constable Forrest and 2 deputies arrived at the residence at midnight to find Marie Lafitte in the front garden, visibly distraught. Her testimony, recorded that night, reads, "I was preparing to retire when I heard Madame Moreau leave her bedroom. I thought perhaps she required assistance, as the doctor had mentioned she might experience confusion upon waking. I followed at a distance and observed her descending to the ground floor carrying a lamp. Against my better judgment, I remained silent and watched as she unlocked the door to the basement, which had been forbidden to all of us for weeks. Something in her manner, a terrible purposefulness, frightened me. I waited several minutes before following her down those stairs." What Marie Lafitte claimed to have witnessed in the Moreau basement would eventually be corroborated by physical evidence, though many details remained subject to speculation. According to her account, she descended the stairs quietly, finding the basement transformed from its former state. Wooden partitions had been erected, creating a small room within the larger space. Inside this room, illuminated by Celeste Moreau's lamp, was what appeared to be a makeshift office, a desk, chair, and several shelves of ledgers. Madame stood before the desk, speaking to it as though someone were seated there, Lafitte testified. She said, "I know you've continued working on them. I can see the changes in the figures. It must stop, Henry. All of it must stop." Then she opened a drawer and removed what looked like a pistol. "That's when I screamed and fled upstairs to send for the constable." When authorities searched the basement, they found the partitioned room exactly as Lafitte had described it. The desk was positioned facing the door, with an empty chair behind it. On the desktop lay an open ledger with entries dated as recently as November 6th, the day before Dr. Blackwood was called to the house. The handwriting matched known samples of Henry Duval's penmanship. More disturbing were the personal items found in a small trunk beside the desk: a shaving kit, several changes of clothing, and a pocket watch inscribed with the initials HD. There was no sign of Henry Duval himself, either alive or deceased. The basement showed no evidence of violence, no bloodstains or signs of struggle. It was as though the missing bookkeeper had stepped away momentarily and might return at any time. Celeste Maro, when questioned about these discoveries, maintained an eerie composure. "Mr. Duval has always been dedicated to his work," she told Constable Forrest. "Perhaps too dedicated." When pressed about why she had forbidden access to the basement and whether she had knowledge of Duval's whereabouts, she replied only, "Some ledgers are best left closed, Constable." Some figures cannot be reconciled. As news of the bizarre discovery spread through New Orleans society, theories multiplied. Some suggested that Henry Duval had been secretly living in the basement by choice, perhaps carrying on a clandestine relationship with the recently widowed Celeste Maro. Others proposed darker scenarios, that Duval had discovered financial improprieties in the Maro business and was being held captive to prevent exposure, or that he had been murdered elsewhere and the basement office was merely an elaborate ruse to confuse investigators. The investigation took a significant turn on November 12th, when Constable Forrest ordered a more thorough search of both the Maro mansion and the company offices on Chartres Street. At the latter location, hidden behind a false panel in Henry Duval's office, authorities discovered a second set of ledgers that differed substantially from the official company records. These shadow ledgers, spanning a period of 17 years, documented transactions not reflected in the legitimate books of the Maro Shipping Company. The entries were coded, but analysis by financial experts revealed a pattern of substantial sums moving through accounts unconnected to the company's declared shipping operations. More significantly, several entries corresponded to dates when Maro vessels had returned from Brazilian ports without officially declaring their full cargo. The discrepancies suggest a long-standing practice of undeclared imports, noted a customs official consulted during the investigation. The amounts involved indicate something far more valuable than the sugar and coffee listed on the manifests. Though never stated explicitly in official records, the implication was clear to those familiar with New Orleans commerce in the 1840s. The Maro ships were transporting enslaved persons from Brazil at a time when the international slave trade had been illegal in the United States for over 30 years. The consequences of such activities, if proven, would extend beyond mere financial penalties. The Additional Act of 1818 had declared slave trading to be an act of piracy, punishable by death. Jacques Moreau, had he still been alive, might have faced the gallows. As it stood, his widow faced financial ruin and social disgrace at minimum, possibly criminal charges if her knowledge of and participation in these activities could be established. On November 15th, Celeste Maro agreed to a formal interview with Constable Forrest and a representative from the Federal Customs Office. The transcript of this conversation, preserved in municipal archives, reveals a woman choosing her words with extreme care. When presented with the shadow ledgers and asked to explain their purpose, she replied, "My husband's business affairs were complex and not always transparent, even to me. Mr. Duval managed these matters according to Jacques' instructions. I assumed the practices continued as established after my husband's passing." The federal agent, less inclined to social niceties than the local constable, pressed harder. "Are you claiming ignorance of illegal slave trading conducted through your family's shipping business, Mrs. Moreau, even after assuming control of the company following your husband's death?" Her response was measured but ambiguous. I am claiming that certain arrangements predate my active involvement in the company. What you have discovered represents the past, not the present or future of Maro Shipping. When asked directly about Henry Duval's current whereabouts and the bizarre basement office, Celeste Maro offered no clarification. Mr. Duval's habits were peculiar but effective. The company benefited from his methods for many years. Beyond that, I cannot speak to his personal choices or current situation. The interview ended without a confession or any actionable information regarding the missing bookkeeper. Celeste Maro was not detained, though Constable Forrest assigned a deputy to observe the Maro residence discreetly. The investigation continued along two parallel tracks: the search for Henry Duval, alive or dead, and the examination of the Maro Shipping Company's financial and shipping records for evidence of criminal activity. On November 23rd, a development occurred that shifted attention temporarily away from Celeste Maro. A clerk at the Bank of Louisiana came forward with information regarding unusual activity in an account maintained by Henry Duval. According to bank records, substantial withdrawals had been made from this account over the previous 2 years, with the funds transferred to an account in a Havana bank. The most recent such transaction had occurred on September 21st, just 2 days before Duval's disappearance. The cumulative amounts suggest Mr. Duval was preparing for a significant change in circumstances, the bank clerk testified. These were not the ordinary transactions of a salaried bookkeeper, but rather the systematic movement of substantial wealth. When investigators inquired about the source of these funds, the clerk could provide no insight beyond noting that the deposits into Duval's New Orleans account had been made in cash, in irregular amounts, over a period of several years. This discovery prompted speculation that Henry Duval had not met with foul play, but had instead absconded with money embezzled from the Maro Shipping Company. The basement office, according to this theory, might have been created by Celeste Maro as an elaborate attempt to cast suspicion on Duval's disappearance rather than acknowledging the theft. However, this narrative failed to explain the presence of Duval's personal items in the basement or the entries in the ledger dated after his disappearance. On December 3rd, 1845, the investigation took another unexpected turn with the arrival of correspondence from authorities in Havana. In response to inquiries from New Orleans, Cuban officials reported that no one matching Henry Duval's description had entered the country through official channels. However, they had identified the account to which Duval had been transferring funds. The account belonged not to Duval himself, but to a woman named Isabel Aguirre, who was described in the report as approximately 30 years of age, of mixed ancestry, residing in Havana since 1840. Who was Isabel Aguirre, and what was her connection to Henry Duval? Investigators initially suspected a romantic entanglement. Perhaps Duval had been planning to abandon his life in New Orleans to be with this woman. However, further investigation revealed a more complex relationship. Isabel Aguirre was born Isabel Maro in New Orleans in 1815. She was the daughter of Jacques Maro's father, Philippe Maro, and an enslaved woman who worked in the Maro household. According to parish records, Isabel had been granted her freedom at the age of 16 and had left New Orleans shortly thereafter. This discovery cast the financial transfers in a different light. Was Henry Duval sending money to Isabel Aguirre out of personal affection, or was there some connection to the shadow ledgers and the suspected illegal activities of the Maro Shipping Company? And how much did Celeste Maro know about these transactions? On December 10th, Marie Lafitte approached Constable Forrest with additional information she had previously withheld. According to her new testimony, she had overheard numerous arguments between Celeste and Jacques Maro in the months before his death, many concerning Henry Duval. Monsieur Maro accused his wife of being too trusting of Duval. Lafitte reported. "He said, he knows enough to destroy us all, and you treat him like family." Madame defended Mr. Duval, saying he had proven his loyalty for 20 years. After Monsieur's death, I observed Madame and Mr. Duval in frequent private conversations. They would stop speaking whenever I entered a room. When asked why she hadn't shared this information earlier, Lafitte admitted to fearing for her position and possibly her safety. "The Maros have significant influence in New Orleans," she explained. And there were rumors among the household staff about the manner of Monsieur Moreau's death. He had been in good health before his sudden illness. This testimony prompted investigators to reconsider Jacques Moreau's death in January 1845. The official cause had been listed as apoplexy, but no autopsy had been performed. Dr. Blackwood, who had attended Moreau in his final days, was interviewed again. While maintaining that the symptoms were consistent with a natural cerebral event, he acknowledged that certain poisons could produce similar effects and might have gone undetected given the medical practices of the time. The possibility that Jacques Moreau had been murdered, potentially by his wife or by Henri Duval, or through their collaboration, added yet another layer to the already complex case. If true, it suggested a conspiracy extending back years, possibly connected to the illegal activities documented in the shadow ledgers. But hard evidence remained elusive. On December 21st, a fisherman discovered a leather satchel tangled in his nets in Lake Pontchartrain, approximately 5 miles from New Orleans. The waterlogged contents included several ledger pages with Henri Duval's distinctive handwriting, personal correspondence between Duval and Isabelle Aguirre spanning several years, and a sealed letter addressed to Constable William Forrest. This letter, carefully dried and preserved, has been transcribed in full in the official case files. It reads, "Constable Forrest, if you are reading these words, then circumstances have unfolded in a manner requiring explanation. A Henri Duval, write this on September 22nd, 1845, with the expectation that events beyond my control may prevent me from delivering this account in person. For 22 years, I have served the Moreau family in various capacities, some known to the public, others necessarily kept private. My employment began under Philippe Moreau and continued under his son Jacques. From the beginning, I was made aware that certain aspects of the family business operated beyond the boundaries of law and propriety. My role in these matters expanded over time from mere documentation to active participation. The business of transporting enslaved persons from Brazil to Louisiana has been profitable but fraught with danger, especially as enforcement of prohibition against such trade has increased. Philippe Moreau established connections in Havana to facilitate the movement of both people and money with minimal scrutiny. Upon his death, Jacques continued and expanded these operations. What neither father nor son knew was my connection to Isabelle Aguirre, née Moreau. I encountered her shortly after her arrival in Havana in 1831. Learning of her parentage and the circumstances of her early life, I felt compelled to offer assistance. Over time, this developed into a collaborative effort to undermine the very trade from which the Moreau family profited. For 14 years, I have diverted a portion of the proceeds from each illicit transaction to an account accessible to Isabelle. These funds have been used to secure freedom for many who would otherwise have been sold into bondage in Louisiana. It was a small redemption for my complicity, though hardly sufficient to balance the moral ledger. Jacques Moreau discovered my duplicity in December of last year. Rather than expose me immediately, he began investigating the full extent of my activities. I believe he intended to use this knowledge to ensure my continuing cooperation while limiting my ability to divert funds. His unexpected death in January changed this dynamic. Celeste Moreau, contrary to her public persona, has been aware of the shadow business since before her marriage. Indeed, Evidence suggests she played a role in expanding these operations during periods when Jacques was abroad. Following her husband's death, she approached me with a proposal. We would gradually unwind the illegal aspects of the business while maintaining the company's profitability through legitimate means. I believed her intentions sincere until September of this year, when I discovered documentation indicating new arrangements with Brazilian contacts. Rather than ending the trade, Celeste planned to restructure it, removing intermediaries, including myself, who might pose a risk of exposure. On the evening of September 23rd, Celeste requested I meet her at the family mansion to discuss discrepancies in the quarterly accounts. I anticipated a confrontation and prepared this letter accordingly. By the time you read these words, I will either have fled New Orleans or met a fate I have long deserved for my participation in these affairs. I direct you to examine the enclosed correspondence with Isabelle Aguirre for corroboration of my account and additional details regarding the Maro operations. While I make no claim to innocence, I offer this testimony in the hope that it may bring an end to practices that have caused immeasurable suffering. With sincere regret for actions that cannot be undone, Henry Duval. The discovery of this letter transformed the investigation. Constable Forrest immediately ordered a more comprehensive search of the Maro mansion, including examination of architectural plans that might reveal hidden spaces beyond the basement office. Meanwhile, federal authorities began procedures to freeze the assets of the Maro Shipping Company, pending a full accounting of its operations. Celeste Maro, confronted with Duval's letter on December 22nd, maintained her composure but declined to respond to specific allegations without legal representation. She was placed under house arrest while arrangements were made for formal charges to be filed. According to the deputy assigned to guard her, she spent that evening in the library, burning papers as she had in the weeks following Duval's disappearance. On the morning of December 23rd, when the deputy brought her breakfast, he received no response to his knock. Upon entering the library, he found Celeste Maro seated at her desk, unresponsive. Dr. Blackwood, summoned immediately, pronounced her dead from what appeared to be a self-administered dose of laudanum. A note found beside her body read simply, "Some ledgers cannot be balanced in this life." The investigation continued despite Celeste Maro's death. On January 8, 1846, based on information provided by Isabelle Aguirre, who had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity, investigators discovered a hidden chamber adjacent to the wine cellar in the Maro mansion's basement. This space, accessible only through a concealed door in the back of a storage cabinet, contained evidence that would have been sufficient to convict both Jacques and Celeste Maro had they still been alive. Most significantly, the chamber held documentation of 73 individuals transported illegally from Brazil to Louisiana between 1831 and 1845. The records included not only names and physical descriptions, but also sale prices and purchaser information, a complete accounting of human beings treated as cargo and commerce. Federal authorities would use these records in subsequent months to identify and prosecute several prominent New Orleans citizens who had knowingly purchased illegally imported enslaved persons. What was not found, either in the hidden chamber or elsewhere on the Maro property, was any trace of Henry Duval's remains. Despite extensive searching of the grounds and dragging operations in nearby waterways, no physical evidence emerged to confirm his death. This absence led some to speculate that Duval had indeed escaped New Orleans, perhaps to reunite with Isabelle Aguirre in Havana or to establish a new identity elsewhere. This theory gained credence in March of 1846, when Cuban authorities reported that Isabelle Aguirre had left Havana abruptly, liquidating her accounts before departure. Her destination remained unknown, though rumors placed her in various locations from Mexico to France over subsequent years. The substantial funds she withdrew, accumulated through Henry Duval's systematic diversion of Maro profits, would have been sufficient to establish a comfortable life far from the shadows of New Orleans. The Maro case gradually faded from public attention as 1846 progressed. The shipping company's assets were liquidated to satisfy creditors and provide some restitution to those victimized by its illegal operations. The Garden District mansion stood empty for several years, its reputation tainted by association with both criminal activity and the rumors of madness that surrounded Celeste Maro's final days. In 1852, the property was purchased by a cotton merchant from Memphis who claimed to be untroubled by its history. According to local newspapers, the new owner commissioned extensive renovations, including the filling in of the basement with soil and gravel before laying a new foundation at ground level. "The past lies buried," he reportedly told neighbors who questioned the unusual construction decision. "New Orleans is a city that understands the value of building atop what came before." The fate of Henry Duval remained officially unresolved. In 1860, a routine review of cold cases by the New Orleans Constabulary resulted in the Duval-Maro file being formally closed, with Duval presumed deceased. The final report noted, "While circumstances strongly suggest that Henry Duval met with foul play in September 1845, possibly at the hands of Celeste Maro, insufficient physical evidence exists to establish this conclusion definitively. Alternatively, Duval may have orchestrated his own disappearance to escape scrutiny for his role in illegal activities. In either case, after 15 years without verified contact or sightings, legal presumption of death is appropriate." In 1868, a professor of history at Tulane University, researching commercial practices in pre-war Louisiana, attempted to locate descendants of the Maro family who might provide access to private papers or oral histories. His inquiries led to a small plantation in rural Cuba, where an elderly woman named Elena Martinez granted him a brief interview. According to the professor's notes, Senora Martinez spoke of New Orleans with the familiarity of a former resident, though she denied any connection to the Maro family. As he was leaving, she reportedly asked, "Do they still tell stories of the bookkeeper who vanished? Of ledgers that could not be balanced?" When the professor expressed surprise at her knowledge of this obscure case, she smiled and replied, "Some debts can never be fully paid, Professor, but that doesn't mean one should stop trying to make partial payments on the account." The professor included this curious encounter as a footnote in his published work, speculating that Elena Martinez might have been a former household servant of the Maros, who had subsequently relocated to Cuba. He made no connection to Isabel Aguirre, whose role in the case was documented only in sealed federal records unavailable to academic researchers at that time. In 1899, during renovations to what had once been the Maro mansion, workers discovered a sealed copper box within the filled-in basement area. Inside was a single item, a pocket watch with the initials HD engraved on the case. The watch, which had stopped at 11:17, was claimed by the property owner as a curiosity and eventually donated to the Louisiana State Museum, where it remains on display in the collection of artifacts related to New Orleans' complex commercial history. The museum's description makes no mention of Henry Duval or the Maro shipping scandal, identifying the watch simply as a gentleman's timepiece, circa 1840, associated with riverfront commerce. Like so many aspects of the city's past, the full story lies buried beneath layers of deliberate forgetting, partial records, and the passage of time. Yet for those who know where to look and which questions to ask, the echoes of the Duval-Maro case can still be detected. In the arrangement of certain ledgers in the city archives, in the architectural anomalies of renovated Garden District homes, in the gaps within family histories that span the Atlantic world, These are the traces of a past that refuses to remain completely buried, even as those who lived it have long since balanced their final accounts. Some say that in the quiet hours before dawn, when the modern city briefly resembles its 19th century self, the sound of a quill scratching against paper can sometimes be heard near the former site of the Maro mansion. Perhaps it is merely the wind through the oak branches, or perhaps it is Henry Duval still attempting to reconcile figures that resist all efforts at balanced resolution. In 1905, a journalist named Frederick Winters became fascinated with the Duval-Maro case while researching an article on historical crimes of New Orleans. Winters spent months examining fragmented records, interviewing elderly residents who claimed familial connections to those involved, and corresponding with archivists in Havana seeking information about Isabel Aguirre. His investigation led him to a small coastal village near Trinidad, Cuba, where local records indicated a woman matching Isabel's description had purchased property in 1847 under the name Isabel Martinez. According to church records examined by Winters, Isabel Martinez was joined at this property by a man identified only as H in 1848. The couple lived quietly, involving themselves in local efforts to improve education for children of all backgrounds. They were remembered by older residents as reserved but generous, particularly toward families recently freed from bondage. Most intriguing to Winters was the discovery of a small private cemetery on what had been the Martinez property. There, a weathered headstone bore the inscription, Henry D., 1807 to 1872. The ledger is balanced. Beside it stood another stone marked simply Isabel, 1815 to 1875. She kept the accounts true. Winters published his findings in the New Orleans Picayune in January 1906 under the title The Bookkeeper's Redemption, New Evidence in the Duval-Maro Mystery. The article caused a brief sensation, with some descendants of prominent families demanding a retraction of what they termed slanderous speculation regarding respected ancestors. The newspaper printed a carefully worded clarification, but did not withdraw the article's central claims. What Winters could not include in his public account, due to the sensitive nature of the information and potential legal complications, was his discovery of a leather-bound journal purportedly written by Isabel Aguirre Martinez between 1846 and 1875. This document, which Winters purchased from a great-niece of Isabel's longtime housekeeper, contained detailed accounts of the operation she and Henry Duval had conducted for over 14 years while he was still employed by the Maros. According to the journal, their efforts had resulted in the diversion of funds sufficient to purchase freedom for 117 individuals who would otherwise have been sold into bondage in Louisiana. More significantly, the journal outlined how Isabel had used her knowledge of shipping schedules and contacts in Brazilian ports to warn potential victims of the Maro operations, allowing many to escape capture entirely. The journal also addressed the events of September 1845, though in terms that left certain questions unanswered. Isabel wrote that she received an urgent message from Henry on September 20th, warning that Celeste Maro had discovered the full extent of their activities. He indicated he would attempt one final confrontation with Celeste before implementing their long-established contingency plan for his departure from New Orleans. "I fear for H's safety, but trust in his caution," Isabel recorded on September 25th. The signals we arranged have not appeared in the expected locations, suggesting complications in his extraction. I have moved forward with financial preparations as planned, but will delay my own departure from Havana until receiving confirmation of his status. On October 30th, she wrote, Word has finally reached me through our mutual friend P that H is recovering but remains in seclusion. The confrontation with CM apparently turned violent, though he managed to escape with his life. He deemed it necessary to establish the appearance of his permanent disappearance to prevent pursuit. The performance, by all accounts, has been convincing. Nowhere in the journal did Isabel explicitly state how Henry Duval had managed to disappear so completely or explain the purpose of the bizarre basement office discovered in the Maro mansion. These omissions led Winters to speculate that some aspects of the affair remained too sensitive to commit to paper, even in a private journal, or that Isabel herself had not been privy to all details of Duval's extraction from New Orleans. The journal ended with an entry dated April 3rd, 1875, approximately 2 weeks before Isabel's death, according to local records. She wrote, "As I prepare to close my accounts in this life, I find myself reflecting on the nature of balance. H often spoke of moral ledgers that could never be fully reconciled given the magnitude of the original debts. Perhaps he was right in a mathematical sense, yet I have come to believe that the attempt at restitution matters more than the final tally. We could not undo all the harm in which we were complicit, but we redirected the course of many lives, including our own. If there exists some cosmic bookkeeper tracking debits and credits of the soul, I hope this is taken into consideration." Frederick Winters died in 1912 without publishing further material on the Duval Moreau case. His personal papers, including his notes on the investigation and potentially the original Isabel Aguirre journal, were reportedly destroyed in a house fire in 1915. This loss, combined with the deliberate obscurity cultivated by the principal figures during their lifetimes, ensured that certain aspects of the case would remain forever mysterious. In 1933, during construction work at the former site of the Maro Shipping Company offices on Chartres Street, workers discovered a sealed cavity in one wall containing a small iron box. Inside were gold coins dating from the 1840s and a single sheet of paper bearing what appeared to be coded financial notations. The paper disintegrated upon exposure to air before it could be properly documented, and the coins were claimed by the property owner. This minor incident received little attention beyond a brief mention in local newspapers. Historians of the period have since attempted to contextualize the Duval-Moreau case within the broader patterns of commerce, law, and human bondage that characterized New Orleans in the antebellum era. The illegal slave trade continued in various forms despite federal prohibition, with profits often outweighing the risks for those involved. What distinguished the Moreau operation, according to available evidence, was its scale, sophistication, and the systematic internal sabotage orchestrated by Henry Duval and Isabel Aguirre. Dr. Eleanor Thibodeau, a historian specializing in Gulf Coast maritime commerce, observed in a 1958 monograph, "The Duval-Moreau case illuminates the complex moral terrain navigated by individuals within corrupt systems. Rather than making a clean break with the apparatus of human trafficking, Duval chose to work within it for years, undermining its operations while maintaining a position that allowed him access and influence. This approach undoubtedly saved many from bondage, but implicated him in the suffering of others. Such compromised resistance raises profound questions about complicity, redemption, and the true cost of operating within evil systems, even with benevolent intent." In 1967, an architectural survey of historic Garden District properties included ground-penetrating radar examination of what had once been the Moreau Mansion. The technology, primitive by modern standards, nevertheless detected anomalies in the filled-in basement area that could not be explained by the known renovation history. The survey report noted, Subsurface features suggest the presence of additional enclosed spaces beyond those documented in available blueprints. Given the property's age and complex history, these anomalies may represent forgotten utility areas or storage rooms sealed during various renovations. No further investigation was undertaken at that time, as the property was privately owned and the findings were not deemed significant enough to warrant disruption of the existing structure. The matter might have ended there, filed away with so many other inconclusive fragments of the case, had it not been for a graduate student named Marcus Reynolds who encountered the survey while researching his dissertation on hidden architectural features in 1969. Reynolds, intrigued by the Maro mansion's history, applied for permission to conduct a more targeted examination using improved scanning technology. The property owner, interested in the historical significance that might increase the estate's value, granted limited access to the grounds. Over 3 days in July 1969, Reynolds and a team from Tulane University's engineering department mapped what appeared to be a small chamber, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet in dimension, separated from the known basement area by a wall of unusual thickness. The resulting paper, published in the Journal of Historical Architecture in 1970, speculated that this hidden room might have been constructed specifically to conceal evidence of illegal activities conducted by the Maro family. Reynolds wrote, "The deliberate concealment of this space, which required significant structural modification to an existing foundation, suggests purposes beyond ordinary storage or utility. When considered alongside the documented history of the property and its owners, the most plausible explanation is that this room was designed to hide evidence of criminality from potential investigations." Reynolds applied for permission to excavate the hidden chamber, arguing its potential historical significance. However, both the property owner and the city's Historical Preservation Committee denied these requests, citing concerns about structural integrity and the disruptive nature of such excavation. The chamber remains unexplored to this day, its contents, if any, still concealed beneath layers of soil and concrete added during the 1852 renovation. In 1984, a collection of letters between Jacques Maro and his Brazilian business associates was discovered during renovation of a former merchant's home in Salvador, Brazil. These letters, dating from 1838 to 1844, contained coded references to human cargo and specific arrangements for evading naval patrols. More significantly, several letters express concern about financial discrepancies and the possibility of internal compromise of their operations. One letter, dated November 1844, was particularly explicit. "Our mutual friend in New Orleans reports growing suspicion regarding D's loyalty. Certain shipments have yielded considerably less than projected, with no clear explanation for the shortfall. While some variation is expected in our line of commerce, the pattern suggests deliberate interference. I advise careful documentation and discreet observation. If our concerns prove founded, swift and permanent resolution will be necessary." This correspondence provided the first documentary evidence that Jacques Maro had indeed suspected Henry Duval of undermining the illegal slave trading operations before his death in January 1845. It also suggested that Maro had been planning some form of action against Duval. Lending credence to Isabelle Aguirre's journal, claim that Duval had feared for his safety long before his disappearance in September of that year. The question of Celeste Maro's role in these events remains perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of the case. Was she, as Henry Duval's letter suggested, aware of and complicit in the illegal operations from the beginning of her marriage? Did she genuinely intend to wind down these activities after her husband's death, only to change course later? Or was she, as some historians have proposed, engaged in a complex game of deception with multiple parties, including both her husband and Henry Duval? The basement office, discovered in November 1845, with its recently used ledgers and Duval's personal items, defies simple explanation. If Celeste had harmed Duval or arranged his disappearance, why create such an elaborate scene? If Duval had escaped New Orleans alive, as Isabel's journal implied, what purpose did the office serve, and who had been making entries in the ledgers? In 1992, Dr. Josephine Lambert, a forensic psychiatrist with an interest in historical cases, published an analysis suggesting that Celeste Moreau had experienced a psychotic break following her confrontation with Henry Duval. According to this theory, the basement office represented an attempt to maintain the illusion that Duval was still present and working, either because Celeste could not accept the reality of what had occurred between them or because she sought to delay discovery of his fate. The testimony regarding Mrs. Moreau speaking to an empty chair, as though Duval were present, suggests a significant dissociative state, Dr. Lambert wrote. Whether this resulted from pre-existing mental instability exacerbated by stress or developed as a response to traumatic events remains unknowable. However, such behavior is consistent with cases where an individual cannot psychologically integrate their actions or experiences. This psychological interpretation adds yet another layer to a case already rich with complexity. Financial fraud, human trafficking, double agents, possible murder and madness, all contained within the respectable facade of a prominent New Orleans family. It is perhaps this multifaceted nature that has allowed the Duval-Moreau affair to maintain its hold on the historical imagination despite the passage of time and the fragmentary nature of the evidence. In 2005, a historian researching the case discovered previously overlooked testimony from a ship captain who had worked for the Maro Shipping Company until 1843. Captain James Sullivan had been interviewed by federal authorities in 1846 during the broader investigation that followed Celeste Moreau's death. In his statement, Sullivan described overhearing an argument between Jacques Moreau and Henry Duval in 1842 regarding the handling of special cargo from Brazil. Moreau accused Duval of deliberately undervaluing the merchandise, Sullivan testified. Duval responded that he was merely recording the actual condition upon delivery, which had deteriorated during transport. What struck me as odd was Duval's insistence on examining each item personally before entry in the ledgers, which seemed excessive for a bookkeeper. When I mentioned this observation to Mr. Moreau later, he became agitated and warned me against discussing company procedures with anyone. This testimony suggests that Duval's efforts to undermine the Moreau operation may have included deliberate devaluation of enslaved persons brought to New Orleans, potentially making them less profitable and thereby discouraging continuation of the trade. If true, this represents yet another method by which Duval attempted to work against the system from within, alongside his financial diversions to Isabel Aguirre. The most recent scholarly examination of the Duval-Moreau case was published in 2017 by Dr. Marcus Chen of Harvard University. His comprehensive analysis incorporated previously scattered evidence, including municipal records, banking documents, shipping manifests, personal correspondence, and architectural surveys. Dr. Chen also employed digital modeling to reconstruct the Moreau mansion as it would have appeared in 1845, with particular attention to the basement areas and possible concealed spaces. Dr. Chen's conclusions, while necessarily speculative in some aspects, represent the most coherent narrative of events yet proposed. He suggests that Henry Duval and Isabel Aguirre began their covert operation shortly after her relocation to Havana in 1831, initially with modest financial diversions that grew more substantial as Duval gained greater authority within the Maro Company. Their activities expanded to include warning potential captives in Brazil and possibly bribing officials to scrutinize Maro vessels more carefully. Jacques Maro began to suspect financial irregularities by late 1844, but may not have initially connected them to the declining profitability of the human trafficking operation. According to Dr. Chen's analysis of correspondence and financial records, Jacques confronted Duval in December 1844 with evidence of fund diversion, but died before taking definitive action. Whether his death was due to natural causes or foul play remains undetermined, though Dr. Chen notes that poison would have been available to both Celeste Maro and Henry Duval, and either might have had motivation to remove Jacques before he could expose their respective activities. Following Jacques' death, Celeste assumed control of both the legitimate shipping business and its shadow operations. Dr. Chen proposes that she initially intended to continue the illegal trade, but with modifications to reduce risk of detection. According to his reconstruction of events, Celeste discovered Duval's connection to Isabel Aguirre in early September 1845, possibly through correspondence intercepted by agents in Havana loyal to the Maro interests. The confrontation between Celeste and Henry likely occurred on the evening of September 23rd, as indicated in constabulary reports. Dr. Chen suggests that this encounter turned violent, with Duval injured but able to escape. The nature of his escape and subsequent movements remains speculative, but the evidence from Isabel's journal indicates he eventually reached Cuba, possibly with assistance from sympathetic crew members on vessels not controlled by the Maro Company. As for the basement office discovered in November, Dr. Chen proposes that Celeste Maro created this space during a period of increasing mental instability following Duval's disappearance. The room may have represented an attempt to maintain the appearance that business was continuing normally, while she determined how to proceed without her experienced bookkeeper. The entries dated after Duval's disappearance were likely made by Celeste herself, attempting to mimic his handwriting, a theory supported by handwriting analysis conducted in 1978 on preserved samples. The hidden chamber, detected by ground-penetrating radar in 1967 but never excavated, represents the final significant mystery of the Maro mansion. Dr. Chen speculates that this space may contain documentation of the full extent of the Maro family's illegal activities, possibly including evidence of other crimes beyond slave trading. Alternatively, it might have served as a temporary holding area for human cargo during transit from ships to auction houses or private sales. Without excavation, which remains unlikely given the property's protected status and the potential structural complications, the contents of this chamber will likely remain unknown. It stands as a physical manifestation of the broader historical challenge presented by the Duval Maro case, tantalizing fragments suggesting a complete narrative that remains just beyond definitive reconstruction. As Dr. Chen concludes in his study, the Duval Maro affair offers a rare glimpse into the moral complexities faced by individuals operating within fundamentally corrupt systems. Henry Duval, rather than making a clean break with the apparatus of human trafficking, chose a path of internal subversion that lasted decades. This approach undoubtedly prevented much suffering, but implicated him in the continuation of the very system he worked to undermine. Meanwhile, Celeste Maro's actions suggest someone navigating between social expectations, business interests, and personal psychological pressures in ways that ultimately proved unsustainable. Together, their intertwined stories illuminate the human dimension of historical forces that shaped New Orleans and the Atlantic world in the 19th century. Today, the former site of the Maro Mansion is occupied by a meticulously restored Victorian residence, its current owners either unaware of or unconcerned by its complex history. The Maro Shipping Company's Chartres Street offices now house a boutique selling artisanal chocolates and local handicrafts. The cemetery where Celeste Moreau was buried contains a modest headstone bearing only her name and dates, with no epitaph to suggest the circumstances of her life or death. Yet for those who know the story, New Orleans offers subtle reminders of the Duval Moreau affair. In the city archives, the shadow ledgers discovered in 1845 are preserved in acid-free containers, their coded entries still bearing witness to commerce in human lives. In the Louisiana State Museum, Henry Duval's pocket watch continues its silent display, the hands frozen at 11:17, marking a moment whose significance remains open to interpretation. And somewhere beneath the Garden District's manicured lawns lies a chamber that has kept its secrets for over 170 years, a physical testament to histories deliberately concealed. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to the complex legacy of Henry Duval and Celeste Moreau can be found not in New Orleans, but in the small coastal cemetery near Trinidad, Cuba. There, two weathered headstones stand as testament not only to lives lived in the shadows of history, but to the possibility, however imperfect, of redirection and redemption. The ledger is balanced, claims Henry's epitaph, a statement that seems simultaneously hopeful and doubtful, suggesting both resolution achieved and the impossibility of truly reconciling such profound moral debts. In the end, the Duval-Moreau case resists neat categorization or conclusive judgment. It offers instead a window into the myriad ways humans navigate corrupt systems, sometimes upholding them, sometimes undermining them, often doing both simultaneously. The contradictions embodied by its principal figures mirror the larger contradictions of their era: commerce and cruelty, propriety and exploitation, resistance and complicity. For modern visitors who pass the former Moreau properties without knowledge of what transpired within their walls, the ghosts of this history remain invisible. But in archives and memories, in hidden chambers and forgotten graves, the echoes persist. They remind us that beneath the visible surfaces of the past, as beneath those of our present, lie complex moral reckonings, attempted balances, and ledgers that perhaps can never be fully reconciled.